In this lecture, we're going to look at the early development of the Hindu religious tradition. As we're going to see, it's kind of a mix between two different cultures. And in this first culture here, the Vedic culture, you can see there's a fire, and we'll talk more about this fire ritual, which is at the heart of that Vedic religious tradition. But first, I want to say something briefly about the Harappan civilization, which flourished approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE in the northwestern part of India. You can see this is roughly the area, the Indus River Valley. And there's some really interesting things that developed in that period. We have these great archaeological remains in several key cities. And certain features of those cities, such as large ritual tanks for presumably bathing, as well as a lot of individual homes having similar kinds of small-scale bathing tanks. It seems to relate to some later Hindu practices, and there are also a bunch of other things that we found that seem to represent aspects that will come out more fully in the more developed Hindu tradition that are sort of missing from the Vedic tradition. Without wanting to get into too much detail, let's just broadly say that there might be some evidence of a little bit more contemplative tradition, and that's really something that we don't see so much of in the Vedic tradition. So the idea is that perhaps there was an indigenous group of people, a civilization that flourished, and it began to fall apart around 1900 due to the drying up of the Indus River Valley at that time. So it went through a dry period, and they depended on that river for transportation and sort of communication within that empire, and there was a lot of trade, and so the empire seems to have collapsed under its own weight, though around that same period is when we have another group of people called the Aryans that are beginning to come into to India a little bit just after that. The Aryans, you've probably heard that name. They are probably most notably associated with the Nazi tradition that Hitler believed that the Aryan race was a pure race, and somehow that was where the Germans came from, and that's why they were purer than other groups. What we can see in this map here is that the original homeland seems to have been around here, and some of them went west into Europe, and then some of them traveled down into Iran and into northwest India, the place that we're interested in. Again, we can't get into much detail, but the main evidence for this is linguistic. That actually, when we look at contemporary English words and other European language words, often the root is said to be an Indo-European root. And what that means is that this group that traveled into northwest India is the same group that traveled west into Europe, and actually there's a tremendous amount of shared language features that we would not expect to find of a group that was entirely indigenous to just the continent of India. So what we get then is the idea that sometime around 1700 BCE, that these groups begin to come into northwestern India. This is contemporary Punjab area, right around the border of Pakistan and India, and a little bit more central, but not making it too far east. A lot of thick forests over here that they couldn't penetrate. And the people that came in were primarily cattle herders, and so they didn't rely as much on the Indus River Valley. They could just graze their cattle and move around. And they were very warlike people, and they had a chariot that they used in war, and they conquered certain areas. So you can see this area here is sort of dominated by this group, but they're clearly not the only group there. There are certainly, if we follow the theory we've been talking about, there are indigenous peoples that speak different languages. And one of the theories is that as they came in, some of those indigenous people were forced down south, and that's the reason why in contemporary India we have a big difference between the southern languages And although there's a great deal of shared culture throughout all of India, that there is a big distinction between southern India and northern India. All the languages of northern India are based on Hindi, which is itself a derivation from Sanskrit, the sacred and spoken language of the Vedic peoples, or the Aryans that came in. Okay, so we have them coming in, and the central ritual that they perform is a fire ritual in which they make all kinds of offerings that they pour into the fire. And so what I want you to do is to watch this video. It's about 10 minutes, 8.5 minutes. You don't have to watch the whole thing. It's pretty repetitive, but certainly read the words that come in the beginning, and then the ritual will start, and watch a couple minutes of it just to get the sense of what's going on. This is a very central Vedic ritual. It is still performed to this day, but it doesn't play the same kind of central role that it did in the earlier tradition. We'll see how that changes as we get on with exploring Hinduism. So watch this video, and then in particular I want you to read this hymn to Agni, and I want you to think about who Agni is. If you want, you can cheat, but you'll have to look it up yourself if you want to cheat. You can look up and see who Agni is. But I want you to read carefully that hymn, and then we're going to discuss it in class. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for now, and I'll come back with the second lecture.